The rather dramatic, maybe over-dramatic title for this talk involves a little malice of forethought. Those of you who were around last year may remember that I gave a talk called Freedom, Sovereignty, and Other Endangered Species. And I rather suspected that Jane might have a masochistic streak and asked me to come back and finish it up. So I left something out, one endangered species, namely the most important one, that is us. Now, that's what I want to talk about now. There's been a lot of doomsday prophesying in the past 30 years or so, ever since Club of Rome and other publications. Actually, I have something a little different in mind. I want to consider the self-destructive tendencies in the institutions that humans have constructed and that now dominate international society. And by institution, I mean the term institutions pretty broadly, including cultural institutions, cultural practices, systems of beliefs and attitudes, and so on. That these institutions in this broad sense have, so in other words, not just socioeconomic and political institutions, though those as well, that these institutions have self-destructive tendencies is perhaps too obvious to waste much attention on. The question is how powerful are they? To what extent are they out of control? Well, any rational person hopes that we won't find out the answer to that question for obvious reasons. And any rational person also knows that whatever the answer is, it will depend a lot upon us here, meaning the United States, people like us within the United States. The reason is simply very simple. It just has to do with just a consequence of the concentration of power and privilege, which is extraordinary, and we're mostly right in the center of us. Well, these ought to be truisms. So let me just, before I go on, add a few others. It's a moral truism that power and responsibility confer power and privilege confer responsibility. That should be obvious. It's an empirical truism that a meaningful effort to live up to that responsibility requires a willingness to look at ourselves without comforting illusions. And it's a historical truism that responsibility is very easy to evade. In fact, one might claim without too much exaggeration that evasion of it is a leading theme of intellectual history. Well, these truisms, I think, are useful to keep in mind as we, if at least we are interested in asking some questions about our place in the world, what it is and what it ought to be. Let me give a couple of current illustrations just to illustrate what I mean. So start with today's newspapers. The New York Times regards itself as the greatest newspaper in the world, correctly, I think. One of the great things about the New York Times is that you can count on it to provide a theme, a good illustration for the opening theme of any political talk, especially any one that's critical of the New York Times and what it stands for. And it didn't fail me this time. I waited and came along just in time. So take the Sunday edition of the New York Times last Sunday. The Week in Review, where you find the deep commentaries, has a major think piece, as usual, on the front page. This one is called How to Face the Past. It's concerned with the crimes of the past century and how they're being faced in the societies that are responsible for them. And it illustrates very well the truisms that I think we should bear in mind. First of all, for one reason, because it's mistitled. The title should have been How Others Should Face the Past and the Crimes of the Past. Notably missing from this long discussion is the topic that would be central to anyone who's serious about the topic and about themselves, namely, what about our crimes? How do we face up to them? Nothing about that. Well, maybe the reason is that there aren't any crimes, so we don't have to face anything. Actually, that is pretty clearly the tacit assumption, and the author has to keep to a rather delicate path to sustain it. So, for example, he mentions that Chile has been, I'm quoting from it, has been slow to face the crimes of the military regime that overthrew the democratic government 30 years ago. Well, another country comes to mind that had some share in that, and maybe they have some questions to face. If so, it's not suggested. Actually, this is a highly misleading example. The reason is that whatever the U.S. crimes may have been in Chile, they're kind of marginal. The major U.S. influence in the Western Hemisphere, in fact in the world in the past century, has been much more direct than Chile and much closer to home, not surprisingly, namely in the Caribbean and Central America. I just happened to have returned from there, so it's in the front of my mind. I went to two countries, Costa Rica, Nicaragua, well chosen to illustrate this topic. Nicaragua and Costa Rica are at opposite ends of the spectrum in the region in terms of quality of life and prospects for the future, including prospects for survival. Costa Rica is the regional exception. It's, by regional standards, fairly well-to-do, more or less of a social democracy. It even approaches the health standards of Cuba. Nicaragua, on the other hand, is right now vying with Guatemala for the position of the second poorest country in the hemisphere. It has achieved that status since the U.S. took it over again 10 years ago, declining rapidly since. The poorest is Haiti, as I'm sure you know. The U.S. took it over 10 years ago after a murderous terrorist war that devastated the country, killed tens of thousands of people, set in motion what's been happening since. The U.S. was condemned by the World Court, ordered to terminate what the court called the unlawful use of force. U.S. responded by rapidly escalating the force. There was a Democrat-controlled Congress that did that. The court was dismissed as with ridicule and contempt. The court ordered the United States to pay heavy reparations, usually estimated around $17 billion. Of course, that disappeared very quickly. The condition on allowing Nicaragua to enter the world system after the U.S. victory was that it drop any such claims, and in fact the way it ends up is Nicaragua's paying reparations to the United States. That's pretty typical. Well, Costa Rica is different. It's the only country in Central America which escaped the terror of the 1980s. Every other country was under either direct or indirect attack by the United States. It was no joke either. It left a couple 100,000 corpses, hundreds of thousands, millions in fact, of refugees and orphans. 3 countries totally ruined, 4th pretty much ruined. As I say, Costa Rica was the exception. In fact, Costa Rica is the only country in the hemisphere, in the region, that has never been attacked directly by the United States. The reasons for that are interesting, worth pursuing. Actually, the answers are revealing, but I'll put it aside and just mention the fact. It's a fact. Costa Rica is the regional exception in this respect as well. It's never been the target of direct U.S. aggression and terror. Haiti, on the other, at the opposite extreme, the poorest country in the hemisphere, happens to have the record for the most severe and intense U.S. intervention, military intervention, and other kind of repression during the past century. That's ever since Woodrow Wilson conquered it in 1915. One of the exercises that's known to those of you who study these things as Wilsonian idealism. The Wilson invasion killed thousands of people, restored virtual slavery. The Marines were sent in to dismiss the Parliament because it was refusing to accept a U.S. written constitution for which FDR took credit, rightly or wrongly. The constitutional the legislative requirement that the U.S. insisted on was that the Constitution of Haiti be revised to allow U.S. corporations to buy up Haitian land, which they agreed to at the point of a gun. Actually, there was a vote which came out something like 99.9% in favor of the 5% of the population who participated. It's called democracy. The Marines left 20 years later, leaving the country a U.S. plantation under the rule of a vicious National Guard, armed and trained by the United States, and it's stayed pretty much that way ever since. So that's the record for the century in U.S. intervention. Nicaragua and Guatemala hold second place for U.S. military intervention in the past century. In fact, in Nicaragua's case, goes back to 1854, when the U.S. Navy burned down a town, port town, in revenge for an alleged insult to the millionaire Cornelius Vanderbilt, who felt his yacht wasn't treated properly when it landed there. Well, without going on, there's a pretty well-established generalization. The greater the U.S. military involvement and control, the greater the poverty and misery. It's a pretty close correlation. A few things in history work out this clearly. And the poverty and misery is quite severe. Haiti and Nicaragua may be literally uninhabitable in another generation or two. El Salvador, which is another leading target of U.S. terror, especially in the 80s, that's not very far behind. Well, these things, they take a considerable effort to ignore, I think, and particularly because they generalize. So in Asia, there's one country that's a basket case, stayed out of the, wasn't part of the Asian economic miracle of the last 20 or 30 years, namely the Philippines, which was conquered by the United States 100 years ago, killing several 100,000 people, stayed a U.S. colony for half a century and a neo-colony ever since. Again, continues to the present. There are other correlations that are, again, kind of tricky to ignore. It takes a little effort, I suppose. One of them is that there's a very well-established correlation, which you can read in the mainstream scholarly literature, in fact, between U.S. aid, including U.S. military aid, and torture and state terror. They correlate very closely. Actually, these studies were done in 1980. Nobody bothered to do them during the 1980s because the results were too obvious. You don't do experiments to show that 2 + 2 = 4. It continues through the 90s, very dramatically, in fact. The leading human rights violator in the hemisphere through the 90s by a considerable margin is Colombia. It's also been the leading recipient of U.S. military aid and training right through the 1990s. In fact, about half of the military aid and training in the hemisphere. So the correlation continues. In 1999, Colombia actually took first place in the world as the leading recipient of U.S. military aid and training. Notice I'm omitting here Israel and Egypt, which are in a separate category. But outside of them, Colombia took first place. It replaced Turkey, which had previously been the leader for some years, except for a brief period when El Salvador took first place during the period of the most intense state terrorist attack, basically U.S. attack against the population. But Turkey had for a while been the leading recipient of U.S. military aid, replaced by Colombia in 1999. Well, why Turkey? Turkey is a strategic ally. It's next to Russia, next to the Middle East. So it had always gotten substantial military aid. It was kind of level into the early 80s. In 1984, the military aid shot up. Notice that had absolutely nothing to do with the Cold War, transparently. What it had to do with is the fact that in 1984, Turkey launched a counterinsurgency campaign against its miserably oppressed Kurdish population. And that required military aid, and the United States was happy to provide it in the interest of human rights and freedom and justice. And the aid stayed very high. As I say, Turkey was first place, though replaced for a while by El Salvador, stayed very high until 1999. The main atrocities were in the Clinton years, and that's when the aid went up as well. As the atrocities escalated, so did the military aid. Clinton administration was providing 80% of Turkey's arms. The peak year was 1997. In fact, in the single year 1997, the United States provided more military aid to Turkey than in the entire period, 1950 to 1983. The entire Cold War period was outweighed in the single year of 1997. And the results were impressive. 2 to 3 million refugees, 3,500 or so villages and towns wiped out, tens of thousands of people killed. Actually, nobody really knows the details. Since it's our crimes, nobody investigates, and it's rarely reported, very rarely, in fact, usually denied. The fact, however, is that this is one of the most extreme examples of atrocities and ethnic cleansing in the 1990s, right through to the late 1990s. Recall that this is within NATO. It's not across its borders where we're supposed to be very upset about crimes. By 1999, the Clinton-backed atrocities and ethnic cleansing had succeeded. The Kurdish insurgency had been crushed. The Colombian insurgency, however, had not yet been crushed. Correspondingly, and if you're rational, perhaps, therefore, Colombia replaced Turkey as the leading recipient of U.S. military aid and training. Well, these again are things you're just not supposed to notice because they conform too well to the moral truism. They tell you too much about our institutions and how they function, and about the intellectual culture that protects and supports them, our culture, which we take part in, contribute to, and sustain. It's not something out there somewhere. The same issue of the New York Times on Sunday also has a book review by a well-known liberal historian about several new books about Vietnam. That's appropriate. We're now approaching the 40th anniversary of the U.S. attack against South Vietnam. Remember that South Vietnam was always the major target of the U.S. attack. Of course, the U.S. said it was there to defend the government of South Vietnam from terrorists from abroad, essentially what the Russians said about their invasion of Afghanistan, and with maybe about half as much legitimacy. But we're supposed to believe it, so therefore that's the line. Anyhow, we're coming up to 40 years. It's 1961 and 62 is when Kennedy launched the direct attack against South Vietnam. That's after about 6 years of U.S. running a Latin American-style terror state there, in which about 60,000 to 70,000 people were killed, eliciting resistance which couldn't be controlled, so the U.S. invaded directly. The results I don't have to go through. You should know them. It's maybe worth mentioning that in a poll a couple of years, I think it's the only poll I know of, where Americans were asked to estimate the number of Vietnamese dead in the war. The average guess was about 100,000. If there was a poll in Germany which revealed that Germans estimated the number of Holocaust victims at 200,000, we might think there's a little bit of a problem in German culture that should perhaps be looked at. But since this is our massacres and atrocities, the question doesn't arise. And it doesn't arise in the review or in the books. The review and the books never suggest that there's anything wrong about anything we did. The only problem is, was it a failure? Why was it a failure? You know, who's responsible, and so on. The kind of questions that the German General Staff would have been raising after Stalingrad, I suppose. That's pretty typical. Just to mention another current case, there was a couple of weeks ago a meeting in Havana, which you probably read about in the paper. It was a meeting of Kennedy advisors and Bay of Pigs veterans meeting with Cubans to go over what happened at the Bay of Pigs invasion. The reports were quite interesting. They also never hinted that there might be something wrong with invading another country. It's always a question of why it failed and that sort of thing. A friend of mine is a veteran Latin American correspondent who actually reported the invasion from Cuba back then. He attended, and I asked him. He told me that at the discussions that question was never raised. Just not an issue. You don't raise that kind of question. Just recently, the State Department released about 1,000 pages of documents on the missile crisis, 1962. A good part of the documents deal with the terror operations that Kennedy organized. Kennedy was a super hawk and deeply committed to massive terror. Cuba was one of the victims. Colombia was another, incidentally. And a lot of this deals with the terror. It wasn't jokes either. It was serious stuff, killings, blowing up installations, blowing up hotels, all sorts of things. There was a review of all of this in Diplomatic History, which is the main serious professional journal. Several reviews, several scholars wrote reviews of the 1,000 pages. One of them, Jorge Dominguez at Harvard, pointed out in his review, he went through the material, but he pointed out an interesting fact, a fact that he felt that was interesting, namely in 1,000 pages of documents on Operation Mongoose and other terrorist operations, he was only able to find one phrase in 1,000 pages that suggested, of these internal discussions and planning and stuff, one phrase that suggested that there may be some problem with this. It was a staffer for the National Security Council who wanted to raise the possibility that if any of these atrocities became public, it might harm the U.S. image in Europe, and therefore didn't care much about Latin America, but might harm it in Europe. And therefore, maybe we should have some second thoughts, or at least keep them more quiet. Remember who these people were. These were the intellectual elite from Harvard, MIT, and places like that. And it's an interesting reflection on the moral and cultural institutions. That's just from current things. It's very easy to find more if you go back. Well, let's go back to the New York Times review, the think piece on how others should face crimes. It opens with the trial of Milosevic right now. And in fact, that's the main theme. The main theme is Serb crimes. The writer points out correctly that the war crimes trial, the International War Crimes Trial, is only for Milosevic's crimes in Kosovo. He didn't ask why that limit was imposed. It's an interesting question, but let's put it aside. Actually, it's not quite accurate either. It's not for Milosevic's crimes in Kosovo. It's for his crimes after March 24th, 1999. If you read the indictment, you find that virtually every crime mentioned that's the day when the U.S. NATO bombing began. Virtually everything mentioned is some crime that took place after the bombing. There are reasons for that time frame as well, carefully evaded in the huge literature that's come out about this topic. Come back to it if you like, but I'll skip it now. Anyway, it's a fact. Virtually nothing in the indictment, few things, but very little before the bombing. So the war crimes trials are in fact for crimes within a very specific time frame, namely the crime, and they're real crimes, no doubt about that, the crimes committed under NATO bombing. The crimes that were incidentally anticipated and not very surprising, doesn't change the fact that they're crimes. Well, without proceeding with that, I'll mention that there's another trial going on right now. It's not in Belgrade or in The Hague, but in Washington. This is the trial of General Johnny Lumintang. He's an Indonesian general who was implicated in planning and executing massive crimes in East Timor in 1999, far beyond anything attributed to Milosevic, I should say. Furthermore, not only are these much worse in character, they also happen to be war crimes, not just crimes against humanity, that is, crimes in the course of aggression, the most serious kind. Furthermore, these crimes were not carried out under bombing by a superpower. In fact, not even under any fighting. There was nothing going on, just plain massive attacks on the civilian population. There was a superpower involved, actually two, the United States and Britain. They had been involved for a long time, 25 years in fact. They were involved in arming and training the killers. That continued right through 1999. In earlier years, their involvement actually was genocidal, one of the places where that overused word really applies. Relative to the population, the deaths, killings were probably greater than anything since the Holocaust. And that continued through 1999. The U.S.-British client destroyed about 70% of the country, drove out 85% of the population, killed nobody knows how many people, and nobody ever will know for a very good reason. The United States prevented the dispatch of any forensic experts, quite different from Kosovo, where the place was flooded by forensic experts to try to dig out crimes of the official enemy, but here they were withheld despite pleas from the UN and Australia. Furthermore, the U.S. has blocked any tribunal, so there'll never be an investigation. But there is a trial going on, Lumintang's trial. Lumintang was served court papers in Washington on March 27th. He was in Washington at the invitation of the State Department. He's one of their favorites. The State Department was pretty upset by the fact that he was handed a subpoena, and the U.S. apologized profusely to the government of Indonesia for this indignity. He was quickly spirited out of the country, but the trial is proceeding in absentia and in silence. There hasn't been a word about it. Good reasons. Unlike Milosevic, under NATO bombing, Lumintang is a U.S.-run criminal responsible for much worse crimes. So therefore, his trial right in Washington, not very easy to ignore, has to be ignored by the usual principles. Well, of course, it could be argued that Lumintang is not the top commander, which is correct. He's greatly implicated. He was not the top commander. The top commander was General Wiranto. He was granted an amnesty in advance, just in case there ever might be a tribunal, not that there's much threat of that. The top leaders are, of course, exempt. And the decisive role of the United States and Britain, that's also exempt. And it is decisive, right back through the Ford and particularly Carter years. In fact, the role of the United States is virtually entirely suppressed in the United States, has been all along, still is. In Britain, not so completely. Britain is not as a less disciplined society than us, not just in this respect. Even worse than that, the current story that's now around, and that will enter history, of course, is that the U.S. led the humanitarian intervention in East Timor because it was so appalled by the crimes, which in fact it was carrying out. This was after it had unfortunately overlooked the crimes of the past 25 years over which it was presiding and for which it provided the crucial military and diplomatic support, with about a third of the population wiped out, all thanks to the complicity of the media and the intellectual culture generally, folks like us, people who are always very agitated about the other guy's crimes. Well, these are near historical universals. It's all too easy to continue this shameful story. Just keeping to the Sunday New York Times, which incidentally I haven't exhausted. I've just sampled. I could go on for another hour on that, but I won't. And I should say that the U.S. and Britain are by no means unusual, and as I've said before, this is pretty standard. The main difference between the United States and Britain and other societies is that the United States and Britain have never been defeated. And furthermore, they have been dominant societies. And for those reasons alone, they have nothing to regret. It follows that if you're not defeated and you're in a dominant position, you didn't do anything wrong. That's kind of like a principle of logic. Therefore, you have nothing to regret. And in fact, you can bask in self-adulation for your courageous leadership in the cause of human rights and freedom and so on. And it's essentially the task of the intellectual community to make sure that this all works very smoothly. And it does. There's rarely a hitch. Well, I should say, and for accuracy, that there sometimes is a hitch. So the charge is not totally accurate. Our country, the United States, as you know, was founded and developed, in fact, on the basis of terrible crimes, slavery and the most extreme ethnic cleansing in history, I suppose. And there have been occasional statements of regret, never any official statements. One of the rare examples, and they are very rare in high places, is John Quincy Adams. He was a major contributor to massive crimes. And long after his involvement in that, long after he was out of office, Adams deplored, I'm quoting, "the heinous sins for which I believe God will one day bring this nation to judgment." He hoped that this belated stand would somehow aid that hapless race of Native Americans that we are exterminating with such merciless and perfidious cruelty. He hoped in vain, of course. The attack escalated very quickly. And continued until the dispossession and the extermination were almost complete, leaving us miraculously guiltless in the eyes of the history that we construct. Actually, how guiltless we are, you can test from your own recent experience. You're all beneficiaries of a good education. I'm sure that, like most people, you were paying a lot of attention last November to stories coming from a county in Florida. The date line was Seminole County, Florida. That was the scene of various electoral shenanigans. You can now carry out an experiment. You can ask yourselves how you would have reacted if there was an election in Germany now, and everyone was focusing their eyes on electoral shenanigans in, say, Kike County, Bavaria. If you can imagine that, you're looking in the mirror. You might, if you don't know why, you ought to find out why. That's back to John Quincy Adams, in fact. Let's go back to all of these are just among the prerequisites of power. You're powerful, you're allowed to do these things. These are illustrations of the truisms that I mentioned. Well, let's look at the question a little bit more generally, back off a little. Actually, the question has been addressed at a very question of whether this will lead to self-destruction. I'm now giving an interpretation of an article that didn't interpret what he said the way I do, but I think it applies. The general question was addressed by the grand old man of American biology, Ernst Mayr of Harvard. He wrote an article a couple of years ago on the adaptive value of higher intelligence, and he was pretty skeptical about it. His reasons were that he said we've had about 50 billion species since the origin of life, only one of which achieved the intelligence needed to establish a civilization. It did so very recently in a very small breeding group from which we're all descended. Probably were lots of other close relatives, but they're gone, probably exterminated, along with big mammals. Anyhow, that's what's left, and that's the one exception. He concludes, Mayr, that this kind of evolutionary accident is not favored by selection. The history of life on Earth, he says, refutes the claim that it's better to be smart than stupid. The successful organisms are stupid. They are adapted to very narrow ecological niches. Beetles, bacteria, actually phage, which are in mass, I suppose, the most successful. Capacity for rapid mutation helps. Mayr adds the rather somber observation that the average life expectancy of the species on Earth is about 100,000 years. It's just about the lifespan of the one species that most radically broke the pattern, and now faces the question of whether it's better to be smart than stupid. That's the question I'm asking. Well, the species is certainly smart enough to have developed the capacity to destroy itself, no doubt about that. And it's also demonstrated that capacity quite consistently throughout history, quite dramatically so in the past several hundred years, with an assault on the environment that sustains life, on the diversity of more complex organisms, and on each other as well. Just the last century, there were about 100 million deaths which are directly attributable to war. The last decade, contrary to what's often said, brought nothing new. The consequences of the collapse of the British and the French and the Portuguese empires were far more destructive than what followed the collapse of the East European tyrannies, and in fact those still remain very prominently on the front pages today, decades later. That's contrary to what's commonly claimed, but that takes us back to the truisms I mentioned earlier. Many of the conflicts of the past decade can be attributed to an enemy empire that collapsed, leaving a terrible legacy, namely the Soviet Union. So therefore those atrocities are real, as distinct from the legacy of our friends and allies, which is incomparably worse, but not real by virtue of the historical truism that of immunity of power and privilege from inspection. Even though the 90s were not unusual, and in fact less destructive than the collapse of earlier empires, Western empires, and even though the number of interstate conflicts has declined quite sharply through the 90s, nevertheless it wasn't a pretty decade. By 1998, internal to state, interstate conflicts had left about 5 million dead, 10 million refugees, 5 million people internally displaced. 40% of those are in Colombia, where the regular increase, about 300,000 a year, of the past decade is expected to accelerate pretty sharply as Washington's war moves into full gear. It's Clinton's planned Colombia. And that's in addition to over 1 million who just fled the country. More ominously still, the kind of intelligence needed to establish a civilization, to which Ernst Mayr referred, it has constructed particular kinds of dominant civilizations, and they are based on institutional structures that do increase the likelihood of dreadful outcomes. The most obvious example is just the international system, which is designed in such a way, structured in such a way that it tends to enhance an apparently inexorable drive to adapt modern technology to the most destructive ends. Nuclear weapons are the most threatening example, and in deference to the principle of looking at ourselves, we might attend to our own the situation right here.